Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. And welcome back to Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. As we know, tensions have been building in the Ukraine between Ukraine and Russia. We know that Vladimir Putin has been accusing the West of breaching security and making the region unsecure and unsafe for Russia. And in a nearly 1 hour speech, he talks about the history of Russia, the history of Ukraine and Russia being together, and he talks about the history of Kiev and how through the Cold War that NATO acted unfairly towards Russia, and how the NATO agreements blocked the unification of Germany, and how the NATO has been acting and is looking to mount missiles and other sorts of weapons in a place that would make Moscow extremely vulnerable, and the government of Russia insecure. He goes on to talk about how he is going to find the separatists and see their plight as sovereign, and he is going to help to protect them. And henceforth, he has ordered troops to move into regions that are held by separatists, and of course accusing Kiev of just simply siding with Western cultures and trying to deny the people of Ukraine their own language and culture as they should have it. Tensions are going to continue to mount because of military presences, and unfortunately, who gets caught in the middle of this are the simple working people of the Ukraine, the simple citizens, just like we are. They're the ones who are going to be left to suffer while powers to be arm, militarize the region, say that they are or they are not looking for diplomatic reasons to negotiate and to come to some sort of peaceful agreement where we all can coexist, where the people of Ukraine and Russia can live peacefully, knowing that they are secure, and allowing the nations of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to exist and do trade in the area. Vladimir Putin also condemns the sanctions and says that he knows that the UN is going to place those sanctions anyway, even though they are being placed unfairly. We're going to hear from the UN Security Council as they're talking about how tensions are mounting up and how a response is going to be needed in order to protect the people of Ukraine. We'll also hear from the National Security Council representative in Washington, D.C., as Washington, D.C. Formulates a response to what Vladimir Putin has said. So let's listen to all the segments and offer our hopes and good wishes to those who are in the region that could turn into a war scene.
We do want to turn back to the breaking news out of Russia at this hour, where the president there, Vladimir Putin, just signed a decree that recognizes 2 breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine as independent states. Now, this is a move that Western allies have warned Putin could use as a pretext for an invasion of Ukraine. Joining me again now, NBC's Matt Bodner in Moscow. Matt, walk us through this. What does this recognition mean for Russia and for Ukraine?
Thank you, Aaron. Well, that's a big question now. So one of the immediate questions is what do we mean when we recognize the independence of Luhansk or Donetsk? The rebel authorities, the rebel groups, do not control the entire kind of official areas that you would consider that on the map, on Ukraine's map, are Donetsk and Luhansk. So there's a question there. Are they just recognizing the parts that the rebels currently control, or is this now a justification to push the Ukrainian military back from the line of contact to essentially the formal boundaries of this region proper? And I do just want to back up for a minute to the actual signing ceremony itself. This came at the end of a very long, fiery speech. We talked about it earlier this hour from Vladimir Putin. Something truly incredible to see from him. Unlike anything we've seen previously, I've been covering him for a long time now, rooted in historical grievances. I'm not really sure there's a more key takeaway from this speech than saying, you know, we have been kind of wondering when the case would be made to the Russian people for action in Ukraine. I think this speech was it. He goes through, he openly questions Ukrainian sovereignty, basically described it as a historical mistake that Russia's been taken advantage of over the past 30 years by the West. Grievance was laced throughout this speech, and it was really quite astonishing. And also, it's clear now that basically everything we saw today, to some extent, was choreographed. From the early reports this morning of a Ukrainian military incursion, or attempted incursion on Russia's borders proper, this led to statements made in the Security Council meeting that Vladimir Putin held earlier today. And now at the end of the speech, he stopped talking, it panned out to a room, and he was on one side of the room and the 2 separatist leaders in the other. This was all a big show. What he does now, we don't know, but he's made his case.
From the very beginning of this crisis, we've been clear that we're prepared either way. We're prepared to respond decisively if Russia moves on Ukraine, and we're prepared for diplomacy to settle this peacefully, including at the highest level. So when President Macron asked President Biden yesterday if he was prepared in principle to meet with President Putin if Russia did not invade, of course, President Biden said yes. But every indication we see on the ground right now in terms of the disposition of Russian forces is that they are, in fact, getting prepared for a major attack on Ukraine. So we will not close the door on diplomacy. We will go the extra mile on diplomacy, but we are also prepared with our allies and partners to respond decisively if Russia attacks.
All right, good afternoon. I can tell you I've gotten a lot of questions on Ukraine before I showed up here. So I can tell you that the Secretary General is greatly concerned with the latest reports of increased ceasefire violations, including the use of heavy weapons across the contact line in eastern Ukraine. We are particularly concerned regarding reports of civilian casualties, targeting of civilian infrastructure, and evacuations. We underline our call for an immediate cessation of hostilities, maximum restraint, and for all parties to avoid any action and statements that would escalate tensions further. All issues must be addressed through diplomacy. Later today, the Secretary General will travel to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to begin a 3-day visit, during which he will attend the 10th summit of the Regional Oversight Mechanisms of the Peace, Security, and Cooperation Framework for the Democratic Republic of the Congo in the region. Tomorrow morning, he will begin his visits in eastern provinces of Ituri and North Kivu to express his solidarity with people who continue to be impacted by violence and instability. He will meet people displaced by conflicts as well as local authorities. We will share detailed updates with you as the trip evolves. And I want to flag for you a very important statement made by the High Commissioner for Refugees today, Filippo Grandi. And he said, in which he expresses deep concern by the increasing number of incidents of violence and serious human rights violations against refugees and migrants at various European borders, several of which have resulted in tragic loss of life. Mr. Grandi noted that violence, ill treatment, and pushbacks continue to be regularly reported at multiple entry points at land and sea borders within and beyond the European Union, despite repeated calls by UN agencies, intergovernmental organizations, and NGOs to end such practices. Mr. Grandi notes that with few exceptions, European states have failed to investigate such reports despite mounting and credible evidence. He pointed out that people fleeing war and persecution have few available options. Mr. Grandi stressed that walls and fences are unlikely to serve as a meaningful deterrent and that they will just contribute to greater suffering of individuals in need of international protection, particularly women and children, and prompt them to consider different, often more dangerous routes and likely risk lives further. Quick update from our UN country team in Iran and on COVID. Led by the resident coordinator, Stefan Preisner, they continue to support the government's response to the health, humanitarian, and socioeconomic needs from the COVID-19 crisis. The country team contributes to boosting the overall health system, disease surveillance and outbreak response, and vaccine cold chains. In January, WHO provided 6 sets of advanced genomic sequencing equipment to 3 diagnostic centers in Iran. The UN team is also providing increased social protection services for those most vulnerable, delivering job creation, skills training, and education opportunities. The initiatives contributed to the creation of over 3,000 jobs and provided support to livelihoods to 4,500 households, with most recipients being women. As of February, 65% of the population in Iran have been fully vaccinated, with the national program now providing boosters to all people 18 years or older. To date, the UN facilitated delivery of almost 14 million COVID-19 vaccines through COVAX, was partly paid for by the Iranian government and partly also from Japan, Germany, and Italy. And today, in case you had forgotten, is International Mother Language Day. The theme this year is using technology for multilingual learning, challenges and opportunities. It raises the potential role of technology to advance multilingual education and support the development of quality teaching and learning for all. UNESCO warns that linguistics diversity is increasingly threatened as more and more languages disappear. According to UNESCO, globally, 40% of the population does not have access to an education in a language they speak or understand. And our thanks today go to our friends in Moldova and Bhutan. Both of them paid their dues in full, taking us to 60 on the fully paid good list. And just a note, a housekeeping note, some of you, there are ongoing technical issues. We don't have our friends online, and that's because during a planned shutdown of electricity in our headquarters campus on Saturday for electrical testing and maintenance, an issue arose that resulted in unplanned power shutdown of the Information and Communication Technology Data Center at UNHQ. As a result, UN websites, including UN.org, a number of departments, including some member states' missions, were not functioning, as well as some local headquarters applications, databases, and IT services. The UN.org page was restored this morning and available online. The work to restore other services is ongoing. A lot of calls about this, speculation of some malfeasance, external malfeasance, but I can tell you this is what we would call in football an own goal. But I know our colleagues in the technical services are trying to fix things as quickly as possible. Ms. Lederer, let's use your mother tongue and speak English.
Thank you, Steph. And let's hope that comes back soon so our colleagues can also ask some questions. I assume you might get some texts. On the Secretary General and Ukraine, the Secretary General has offered his good offices. Has anybody responded and asked him to use his good offices?
The Secretary General continues to be in contact, and his staff continue to be in contact with various parties, but there is no good offices mission that I can share with you.
Okay, and a second question on Mali. The military government announced today that they were going to rule for up to 5 years. Does the Secretary General have any reaction?
Well, to reiterate what we've said about Mali and other places where there have been coups, we would like to see a transition as quickly as possible and in time frame that would be that would see the restoration of democratic rule quickly. Yes, sir.
Hi, Stefan. I have several questions. First question is, of course, concerning Ukraine. Because this morning, Russian Security Council had a meeting. It seems everybody agreed that to recognize Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. And we have been told that the Russian President Vladimir Putin will make a TV address soon on this issue. So what would be the response from the United Nations?
Well, let's wait for an announcement for me to respond. What I can tell you and reiterate our position, which that the United Nations fully supports the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, as stated very clearly in relevant General Assembly resolutions. And again, we would encourage everyone involved to refrain from any unilateral decision or unilateral action that could undermine the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and the implementation of the Minsk agreements, I think, is endorsed by the Security Council, and with regards to the status of Donetsk and Luhansk.
And the second question is about the abducted UN staff in Yemen, because we know a week ago, like there were five staff kidnapped in Yemen. What's the latest situation? Because we have some report from the local news agency said that the local tribal leaders tried to mediate, and it got failed. So
I mean, the only update to tell you is that our 5 colleagues who were kidnapped continue to be held, and we're working as hard as we can with various interlocutors to try to secure their release.
And the third question is concerning Syria, because last Sunday the permanent representative France accepted an interview called the Syria. It describing the political and constitutional process as a joke. So it seems like everybody's still talking about the constitutional committee and also talking about to solve the Syrian crisis, which lasted over. I
have not seen. I have not seen that interview. I would refer you to. No, I don't doubt your. I just haven't seen it, and I would refer you back to what Mr. Pedersen himself said on the importance of the next round, which he intends to call soon. Philippe.
Merci, Stéphane. On Ukraine, are you still in the same position, not to evacuate or to relocate UN employees?
I think just to the situation is as follows: is that we are continuing to be committed to staying and delivering in Ukraine, especially in eastern Ukraine. Our operations continue to be fully operational. Our staff numbers is not really changing in that part, including internationals and nationals. We had a convoy of about 12 trucks that crossed the line of contact on Friday after some difficulties that were ruled out. We are, as a result of the evolving situation on the ground, we've allowed for temporary relocation of some non-essential staff and some dependents. At the same time, we have more staff coming in. right, to support our operations. I think one has to understand that there are, Kiev is a family duty station. Obviously, there are things going on that are outside of our control that make it difficult sometimes for families to remain. So the point is, staff in the eastern part of the Ukraine remains unchanged, internationals and nationals. More staff is coming into Ukraine to support the UN's operations. Some people who have, for personal reasons, need to be temporarily moved out are being moved out.
So you have more than 1,661 employees now?
At this point, the latest numbers that I have is overall total in Ukraine is 2,696. We have about 100 personnel who are operating in the eastern Ukraine, both nationals and internationals. I'll come back to you a second. Gregory.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Does the Secretary General have any plans to contact with Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers? Thank you.
Sorry?
Does Secretary General have any plans to contact in near future with Ukrainian and Russian foreign ministers?
He will be in contact as necessary. No new contacts since what we previously announced. Senora.
Stefan, today was known that a letter was sent to Michelle Bachelet from the ambassador of the United States at the office in Geneva. And they're alerting the United Nations, and specifically the High Commissioners for Human Rights, of the possibility of the actions of the Russian government if they were to invade Ukraine. According to the letter, they have credible information that indicates the Russian forces are creating a list of unidentified Ukrainians.
So, I mean, what I can confirm is that the letter has been received by our human rights colleagues in Geneva, and it is so any questions should go to them. Obviously, for us, it's critical that all governments contribute to the de-escalation of tensions in engaging in diplomacy in good faith. I just want to correct something on the numbers because the actual number of staff is 1,510. The greater number I gave you included dependents. So just UN staff, to be clear, is 1,510 in Ukraine currently.
Just a quick,
a
quick follow-up to the letter that was sent by the United States. In the letter, they were very specific about the plans and camps, torture, killings. What a message does that send to the world when we're seeing these type of reports and letters coming into?
Look, we have, we've seen a lot of reports about different things happening in different places. We don't have any independent information to that. The letter was sent to Madame Bachelet, I think, to share with members of the Human Rights Council. We are on the ground in Eastern Ukraine delivering humanitarian aid. Our human rights colleagues, as you know, also have a human rights monitoring mission. They report back regularly. So we can only speak and confirm about what we know or what we've been, or if information has been shared with us. Edie, please.
We're making about possible steps in this regard. Once again, I would like to underscore that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country to us. It is an inherent part of our own history, culture, spiritual space. They are our comrades, relatives, not only colleagues, friends, but also our family, people we have blood and family ties with. Since ancient times, people from ancient southwestern Russian lands were calling themselves Russians and Orthodox. That was happening until 17th century, when part of these territories rejoined the Russian Empire, the Russian state. And after that, it seems that we know all about this, that we are talking about facts that everyone knows, but at the same time, we need to have understanding what is happening today to explain motives and aims that Russia has. We need to say a couple of words about the history of this matter. I would like to start by saying that the modern Ukraine was completely created by Russia. To be more exact, by Bolshevik communist Russia. This process has started almost immediately after the 1917 revolution. And Lenin and his supporters did it in a rough way. If we talk about Russia, they were alienating parts of historical territories of Russia. And millions of people who lived there, obviously no one asked anything. Then before the Great Patriotic War and after it, Stalin added to the USSR and handed over to Ukraine some lands that belonged to Poland and Hungary. And as a compensation, Stalin gave some ancient German lands to Poland. And in the 1960s, Khrushchev decided to take Crimea away from Russia and also gave it to Ukraine. That's how the territory of the Soviet Ukraine was formed. But now I would like to draw your attention to the initial stages of the establishment of the USSR. I think it's of utmost importance for us because we have to start from afar. I would like to remind you that after the October Revolution of 1917 and the civil war that followed, Bolsheviks started building a new state. And they had some differences among them. Stalin, who in 1922 was at the same time Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party and People Commissar on the matters of ethnicities, decided to build the country on the principles of autonomy, thus giving to the republics, to the future administrative units, wide authority when they were supposed to join the state. Lenin criticized this plan, and he suggested to make concessions to the nationalists, the way he called them back then advocates of independence. Basically, that was the idea about creating a confederation and give the right to every nation for self-determination. That was the basis of the Soviet state. First, in 1922, it was enshrined in the Declaration on the Establishment of the Soviet Union, and then, after the death of Lenin, it was also enshrined in the Constitution of the USSR of 1924. And right away, here we have a lot of questions. It raises a lot of questions, and first of them, and the main question, why were they making all kinds of concessions to the nationalists at the outskirts of the former empire, to give to the administrative units that were haphazardly formed huge territories, oftentimes that had nothing to do with them, and they were giving these territories with the population of historic Russia, and these administrative units were given status and shape of the state entities. And once again, this begs a question: why did they have to do such generous gifts, even the most blatant nationalists couldn't dream of, and at the same time give the Republic a right to withdraw from the new state without any preconditions? At first glance, it doesn't seem clear. It seems like madness, but only at first glance, because there is an explanation. After the revolution, the main goal Bolsheviks had was to keep power, to stay at power at any cost. And for this, they went to any length to sign humiliating conditions of the Brest truce when the Kaiser's Germany were in the dire economic situation and the outcome of the World War I was already almost decided, and by giving any concessions to the nationalists inside the country. From the point of view of the historic destiny of Russia and its people, Lenin's principles of building the state weren't a mere mistake. That was much worse than a mere mistake. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, this has become absolutely obvious. Of course, what happened in the past cannot be changed, but at least we have to talk about it in an honest and direct way, without any political agenda, without giving any political color to it. I can only add that the ideas of the current political realities, no matter how beneficial they might seem currently, under no circumstances cannot and should not be a basis of the building a state. I'm not blaming anyone, accusing anyone of anything. The situation in the country back then and after the Civil War and before the Civil War was incredibly difficult, was critical. And now I only can say that that's how it happened. That's a fact, that's a historical fact. And as a result of Bolsheviks' policy, the Soviet Ukraine was created. And we have every reason to say now that it's Ukraine created by Vladimir Lenin. He's its creator and architect. And it's fully confirmed by the documents from the archives, also including the decrees, Lenin's decrees regarding Donbass that was added to Ukraine. And now, grateful descendants demolishing all the statues, all the monuments to Lenin. They call it decommunization. You want decommunization? Well, we are quite happy with that. But don't stop halfway. We are ready to show you what would mean actual decommunization for Ukraine. Coming back to the history of the matter, I would like to remind you that back in 1922, at the territory of the former Russian Empire, the Soviet Union was established, but the reality showed that keeping this territory and ruling this territory using the principles of confederation deems impossible, because it had nothing to do neither with the realities nor with the historical tradition. And the Red Terror and switch to the Stalin's purges and the monopoly of the Communist Party, nationalization, planned economy, all that in reality was turned into a formality, nothing more. Principles that were declared but didn't actually work. In reality, Soviet republics had no sovereign rights. None. In practice, what was created, strictly centralized, unitarian in its character. State that was centralized. Stalin implemented not Lenin's ideas, but his own ideas of how state should be built. But changes to the founding acts, to the constitution, he didn't make any changes in this regard. Lenin's principles about building the Soviet Union were not reconsidered technically. It seemed there was no need in this. Under totalitarian regime, authoritarian regime, everything worked well, and it looked nice from the outside. It looked more than democratic even. But still, it's a shame. It's a shame that from the formal foundations our state was built on, they didn't clear out this odious, utopic, brought about by the revolution, but destructive fantasies. And in the future, how it often happened, no one thought about it. The leaders of the Communist Party seemed to be confident that they managed to build a strong governing system, that using this policy they managed to finally resolve the national issue, but replacing the notions, manipulating the public moods could cost dearly. The infection of nationalism did not disappear, and that bomb that was undermining the state with this infection of nationalism was just waiting for its hour to come. Because once again, any republic had the right to withdraw from the USSR. In the middle of 1980s, against the background of raising problems, crisis of the planned economy, the nationalist issue that was caused not by some ideas of the Soviet peoples, but by growing appetites of the current leaders was escalated. But the USSR leadership, instead of analyzing the situation and making thoughtful decisions in the economy and in the political system, in the governing system, they were only talking about restoring Lenin's principles about national self-determination. More than that, inside the Communist Party there was a struggle for power, and each side, wanting to expand its support, started to encourage this nationalism. They were trying to play with it. They were promising anything to this nationalism. And when they talked about the democracy and bright future based either on the market economy or a planned economy, but when in reality people were getting poorer and poorer, and the deficit got stronger, no one from the authority was thinking about tragic consequences. And then they went down well-trodden path of satisfying the ambitions of nationalist elites that were raised inside the party. Because the Communist Party doesn't have these tools anymore, which is good. So they couldn't keep the power, and they couldn't use such tools as dictatorship or purges, and even the governing role of the party was diluted like the fog in the morning in front of their eyes. And in September 1989, at the plenary session of the Communist Party, was made a fateful decision, the national policy of party under current conditions. So that these are the stipulations it had. Soviet republics have all the rights to exercise their status of the sovereign Soviet republics, and the highest governing bodies can stop any decrees and any laws of the Soviet government in their territories. And finally, every Soviet republic has its citizenship that is given to all its citizens. Wasn't it obvious what will be the outcome of such decrees? Now it is not the time and the place to talk about the constitutional right or give definition of what citizenship is, but still it begs a question. Why, in those difficult conditions, they needed to make the situation even less stable? But the fact is still a fact. 2 years before the Soviet Union collapsed, it was doomed. Now radicals and nationalists, including, and first of all, in Ukraine, they take the merit of winning independence. But we can see that that's not the truth. What happened to our country was caused by the mistake done by the leadership of the Communist Party, made at different stages and at different times in their national and economical policies. The collapse of historical Russia, named the Ussr, was brought about by them. And despite all this, despite stealing from the people, our people agreed to the new realities that were brought about by the collapse of the USSR. They recognized new states, new republics, not only recognized. Back then Russia was in dire situation, but it tried to help its partners from the CIS, including Ukrainian partners, because starting from the moment of proclaiming independence, they started making requests for the material support. And our country was giving this support with respect to the sovereignty of Ukraine. According to the estimates of the experts, that can be proved just by looking at the prices of our energy carriers, by our loans, about trade preferences that Russia was giving to Ukraine. The total profit for the Ukrainian budget since 1991 to 2013 was about $250 billion. But that's not all of it. By the end of 1991, the debt of the USSR and from the other states in international fund was about 100 billion. And initially it was thought that this debt would be paid out by all the republics of the USSR in proportionate terms, in proportion with their economic potential. But Russia took the burden of paying out the entire Soviet debt and paid it out eventually. And we completed this process in 2017. And the other Soviet republics had to renounce from the Soviet assets, and such agreement was signed in late 1994 with Ukraine, but Kiev didn't ratify this agreement, and later they refused to implement it. They were talking about golden reserves and about all kinds of assets of the former Soviet Union abroad. And still, despite the known problems, Russia has always cooperated and worked with Ukraine in an open and honest manner with respect to its interests. Our ties in all kinds of areas were developing. So, in 2011, the trade turnover was more than $50 billion. And allow me to mention that the trade turnover of Ukraine with all the EU countries in 2019, before the pandemic, was smaller than that. And at the same time, it was noticeable that the Ukrainian authorities preferred to act in such a way that to have all the rights and preferences in the relations with Russia, but to carry no obligations at the same time, assuming no obligations. So it wasn't really a partnership. They were just trying to get more from Russia, and sometimes it looked unceremoniously. For example, remember the blackmailing in the gas transit, stealing gas even. I would like to remind you that they were trying to use dialogue with Russia as a tool to blackmail the West. They said that they would get closer to Russia, trying to win preferences. They were saying that if not, the Russian presence in Ukraine will grow. And from the very first steps, they started building their statehood by renouncing everything that was bringing us together. They were trying to twist the historical memory of the generations of people who lived in Ukraine. So it comes as no surprise that the Ukrainian society faced the growth of the radical nationalism that became Russophobic and nationalist. That's why there are neo-Nazis and joining gangs in eastern Ukraine. The territorial claims against Russia were voiced more often. And the outer forces were also using their special services to raise their people in Ukraine and to move them into power, into the government. Ukraine has never had stable traditions of their own statehood. Starting from 1991, they followed the path of the mechanical copying of foreign models that had nothing to do with their history or with the Ukrainian realities. Political and state institutions were changed to benefit the clans with their own interests that had nothing to do with the interests of the people of Ukraine. The whole idea of the so-called pro-Western civilizational choice of the Ukrainian democratic power was and is still not in creating better conditions for the good of the people, but to serve the geopolitical adversaries of Russia to save billions of dollars they stole from the Ukrainians and hidden by oligarchs on the accounts in Western banks. Some financial groups who paid politicians first, they based on radicals and nationalists. Others, they were saying for good, friendly relations with Russia, for cultural and language versatility, and they were coming to power using the votes of the people who really wanted to see it happen, including the people from the Southwest. But after they were assuming office, after getting high positions, they were betraying their people who elected them, their voters, and they followed the radical ideas in their policies. Sometimes they were even punishing people who wanted to cooperate with Russia, who wanted to keep both languages viable. And those people who supported them, of moderate views, who are used to trust the power, unlike radicals, they would never be aggressive to use unlawful means. But radicals were becoming more and more brazen. Their claims were becoming bigger and bigger, so they had no problem to influence the weak power that was weakened by the virus of corruption. And they were replacing cultural, economic, social interests of the people, actual sovereignty of Ukraine by speculations on nationalist ground. The stable statehood hasn't been built in Ukraine, and political electoral procedures served just as a screen to divide power and assets between oligarch clans. Corruption, that is a problem to a lot of countries, including Russia, in Ukraine has become a thing of its own. It's been corroding the entire system, all the branches of the state. And radicals used unhappiness of the people, fear and happiness, so they rode that wave, and they turned Maidan in 2014 into coup d'etat. And they were backed by the foreign states. From the data that we have, the support of the so-called protest camp at the Independence Square in Kyiv from the U.S. Embassy was $1 million per day. And additionally, large amounts of money were transferred to the private accounts of the leaders of opposition, and we are talking about tens of millions of dollars. And how much did those who really suffered, those who died during the clashes at the squares and streets of the Kyiv got? You better not know. You better not ask. Radicals who captured the power, they started terror against those who were supporting constitutional law, against journalists, against politicians. They were humiliated publicly. The whole range of large-scale criminal cases covered Ukraine. We cannot but shudder when we remember about the situation in Odessa when people were burned alive when they protested the authorities. And those criminals who did this, they are not punished. No one is even looking for them. But we know their names, and we will do everything to punish them, to find them, and to bring them to court of justice. Maidan didn't bring Ukraine closer to democracy. After perpetrating coup d'etat, nationalists and those political forces that backed them brought the situation to the deadlock. They pushed Ukraine into the chasm of civil war. And 8 years later, the country is divided. It's going through dire economical crisis. According to the estimates of international organizations, in 2018, almost 6 million Ukrainians, which is almost 15%, not of the able population, but of the entire population, had to move abroad looking for jobs. And as a rule, they were doing some basic work and qualified work. And here is another fact. Starting 2020, 60,000 doctors and other medical professionals left the country. Since 2014, the water prices increased by almost one-third. Energy prices increased manifold. Many people have no money to pay for the utility bills. They have to survive, literally. What happened? Why all this is happening? The answer is obvious, because things that they inherited from the Soviet Union, from the Russian Empire, was literally stolen, hidden in pockets. Hundreds of jobs were lost that were giving stable income to the people with the participation of the Russian Federation. Such areas as machine engineering, power industry, plane aircraft manufacturing. They are either in crisis or destroyed. And the entire Soviet Union used to be proud of these industries. In 2021, the shipbuilding factory in Nikolaev was closed. Industry, plane, aircraft manufacturing. They are either in crisis or destroyed. And the entire Soviet Union used to be proud of these industries. In 2021, the shipbuilding factory in Nikolaev was closed. Famous Antonov contract starting from 2016, they haven't produced a single plane. And Yuzhmash factory that was building a space-grade machinery, they are almost bankrupt. Same like the Kremenchuk steel factory. As for the gas transport system that was built by the entire Soviet Union, it has become so dilapidated that using it has a lot of risks. And in this regard, we have a question. This poverty, loss of the industrial and technological potential, is that the choice, the pro-Western choice that was put into the heads of the people for years now? Is that it? In reality, everything comes down to the fact that the collapse of the Ukrainian economy goes along with robbing the Ukrainian people, and Ukraine itself is now being controlled from the outside. It is perpetrated not only by the instructions from the West, but also locally via a network of foreign consultants, NGOs and other institutions deployed in Ukraine. They have direct influence on all the important decisions at all the levels of government, from the central down to the municipal. It influences the main state corporations, Ukrainian railways, energy complex, Ukrainian post, administration of the seaports of Ukraine. And Ukraine doesn't have independent court system anymore. The Kiev authorities gave the preferential right to choose the members of the supreme legislation court bodies. And via its embassy in the U.S., the embassy of the U.S. directly controls the National Agency on Preventing Corruption, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, Specialized Anti-Corruption District Attorney Office, and Anti-Corruption Court. It's all done under the pretense to increase the efficiency of fighting corruption. Well, okay then, but where are the results? Because corruption is still there. It's even worse than it was. Do Ukrainians know about these choices? Do they understand that their country has become not even a protectorate, now it's a colony with puppets at its helm? The privatization of the state has led to the fact that the authorities that call themselves the authorities of patriots doesn't have interest of the nation, but otherwise they continue to assimilate Russian speakers by force. They are adopting more and more discriminatory decrees. Now they have a law on the native nations, those people who deem themselves Russian. They are let know that they do not belong in Ukraine. According to the laws on education and on Ukrainian language as a state language, Russian language is being thrown away from schools, from all public spaces, including shops. The so-called lustration law, cleansing of the power, allowed them to chase away public servants that they don't like. They adopt decrees that allow law enforcement to suppress the freedom of choice, the freedom of speech. We know the sad practice of unilateral illegitimate sanctions about other states, about the foreign individuals and legal entities. In Ukraine, they went even further than their Western partners. They came up with such an instrument as sanctions against their own citizens, entities, media outlets, even parliament members. In Kiev, they are preparing decrees against the Russian Orthodox Church. And that's not an emotional estimate. We have certain documents. We have decisions that is talking about this. The split in church in Kyiv, they cynically turned into an instrument of national policy. The current leadership of the country does not react to the requests of the people to cancel the laws that undermine the rights of the believers. And now they have new laws adopted against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And I would like to talk separately about Crimea. Population of the Crimea Peninsula made their choice to be with Russia. Ukrainian authorities have nothing to say against this. That's why they place their bets on aggression. They use cells of extremists, including the radical Islamic organizations. They are sending saboteurs to destroy vital infrastructure. They kidnap citizens of Russia. We have proof, we have evidence that such aggressive activities is perpetrated with the support of foreign special services. In March of 2021, Ukraine adopted new military strategy. This document almost completely aimed at confrontation with Russia. They want to drag foreign states into the conflict with our country. The strategy suggests to organize Russian Crimea and in Donbass, basically a terrorist underground. And it also outlines the possible war, and it is supposed to end the way the Ukrainian strategists now think, with the support of international community on the beneficial conditions, beneficial for Ukraine. And also, as they say in Kyiv now, and I'm quoting also, just listen to it carefully, with the military support of the world community and geopolitical confrontation against the Russian Federation. Basically, that's nothing but preparation for armed conflict against us, against Russia. We also heard statements about Ukraine wanting to create their own nuclear weapon. And that's not just idle threat. Ukraine really has nuclear technology and carriers to deliver such weapons back from the Soviet times. And they have Tochka-U launchers, also designed in the Soviet Union. It has range of more than 100 kilometers, and they can increase that. It's a matter of time. They still have this technology from the Soviet times. So getting tactical nuclear weapon will be much easier for Ukraine than for certain other states. I'm not going to list them that are now researching this, especially if they have technological support from abroad. And we can't exclude this. If Ukraine has a weapon of mass destruction, the situation in the world, in Europe, especially for us, for Russia, will change drastically. We cannot help but react to this real threat, especially since I would like to reiterate that the Western backers, they can help Ukraine with getting this weapon to create yet another threat for our country, because we can see how consistently they are pumping Ukraine with weapons. The United States alone, starting from 2014, transferred billions of dollars, including the arms supply, training, personnel. In recent months, Western weapons are sent to Ukraine ceaselessly in front of the eyes of the entire world. The activities of the Ukrainian army is governed by the foreign consultants, and we are well aware of that. Last year, under the pretext of the war games, the military contingents of the NATO countries were deployed in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is already integrated into NATO. It means that Ukrainian army units can be done directly from the NATO headquarters. The West started to explore the territory of Ukraine as the future theater of military action, as the future battlefield, and it is aimed against Russia. Last year alone, it had more than 20,000 troops and more than 1,000 equipment, hardware units. And NAPFOR, they have already adopted a law to allow the foreign troops to enter the territory of Ukraine to participate in the war games. And first of all, it means the NATO troops. And this year, they planned no less than 10 drills like that. And it serves as a cover to increase the NATO contingent in Ukraine, especially since the network of airfields, Borispol, Ivano-Frankivsk, Chuguyev, Odessa, and so on, it can be used to deploy troops in shortest terms. The airspace for Ukraine is open for reconnaissance and strategic planes of NATO, unmanned drones that are used to monitor the territory of Russia. And the Naval Operations Center built by the Americans in Ochakov allows NATO ships to use it as a port and allows to use high-precision weapons against Black Sea Navy and our entire infrastructure on the Black Sea coast. Some time ago, the U.S. wanted to build such infrastructure in Crimea, but the population of Crimea and Sevastopol, they said for no, and we will remember that. But now, this center has already been built and deployed in Ochakov. And I would like to remind you, in 18th century, Alexander Suvorov's soldiers fought for this city, and it's their bravery allowed it to add this city to Russia. Back then, in the 18th century, the Black Sea coastlands that were got from Turkey, from Ottoman Empire, was given name Novorossiya. Fought for this city, and it's their bravery allowed it to add this city to Russia. Back then, in the 18th century, the Black Sea coastlands that were got from Turkey, from Ottoman Empire, was given name Novorossiya. Now they want to forget this name, like they want to forget the deeds of the famous commanders without which Ukraine itself wouldn't have access to the Black Sea. Recently in Poltava, they demolished the monument to Alexander Suvorov. Well, what can I say? You are renouncing your own path, the so-called colonial legacy of the Soviet Empire. Well, be consistent then. Article 17 of the Constitution of Ukraine doesn't allow military bases of foreign states to be deployed in their territory, but it seems that it can be bypassed. They have deployed training missions of the NATO countries in Ukraine. Basically, that's a military base already. They just call it a mission, and it's done. In Kiev, they have launched
it's time to take care
bases of foreign states to be deployed in their territory, but it seems that it can be bypassed. They have deployed training missions of the NATO countries in Ukraine. Basically, that's a military base already. They just call it a mission, and it's done. In Kiev, they have long declared strategic aim at joining NATO. Yes, obviously, every country has the right to choose their own alliances, to sign military agreements. That's true, but there is one. But in international law, it says there is a principle of indivisible security, which states that one country cannot enhance its security at the expense of security of others. And I can refer here to the European Security OSCE Charter that was adopted in Istanbul in 1999 and Astana OSCE Declaration from 2010. In other words, choosing means to enhance one's security should not create any threats for other states, and if Ukraine was to join NATO, would serve as a direct threat to the security of Russia. And I would remind you, back in April of 2018 at the Bucharest summit of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, USA forced these members to make a decision that certain states were to join NATO. A lot of European allies already back then understood all the risks of such a step, but they had to subdue to the will of their older partner. Americans used them to pursue anti-Russian policy. Some NATO members still are skeptical about Ukraine joining NATO, and from some European capitals we get a signal. They are saying, so what are you worrying about? It's not going to happen tomorrow. And now our American counterparts are saying the same. We say, okay, it is not going to happen tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow then. What will it change in historical context? Nothing. More than that, we know the stance and the statements of the U.S. leadership about the active confrontation military actions in the east of Ukraine would not stop Ukraine to join NATO if it will correspond to the criteria of the NATO Charter and if they can overcome corruption. And they try to convince us that NATO U.S. leadership about the active confrontation military actions in the east of Ukraine would not stop Ukraine to join NATO if it will correspond to the criteria of the NATO Charter and if they can overcome corruption. And they try to convince us that NATO is a peaceful and defensive bloc, so there is no threat for Russia. And they, again, suggest we believe their words, but we already know the value of such words. Back in 1990, when we talked about uniting Germany, the USA promised to the Soviet leadership that neither jurisdiction nor military presence would not move an inch to the east, and unification of Germany would not lead to the eastward expansion of NATO. And I'm quoting here. So they were saying all these things, they were giving us assurances, but these were just words later. They started saying that Central European and Eastern European countries joining NATO will improve their relations with Moscow, will rid these countries from the fears of their difficult historical legacy, and more than that, it will allow them to create this belt of the friendly nations. But it was the other way around. These states are now bringing their stereotypes, their complexes of the Russian threat to NATO. They insisted on increasing potential of collective security that was supposed to be deployed against Russia, first of all. And it was happening back in the 1990s and early 2000s, when, because of the openness and goodwill, our complexes of the Russian threat to NATO. They insisted on increasing potential of collective security that was supposed to be deployed against Russia, first of all. And it was happening back in the 1990s and early 2000s, when, because of the openness and goodwill, our stereotypes, there are complexes of the Russian threat to NATO. They insisted on increasing potential of collective security that was supposed to be deployed against Russia, first of all. And it was happening back in the 1990s and early 2000s, when, because of the openness and goodwill, our bringing their stereotypes, their complexes of the Russian threat to NATO. They insisted on increasing potential of collective security that was supposed to be deployed against Russia, first of all. And it was happening back in the 1990s and early 2000s, when, because of the openness and goodwill, our There are stereotypes, there are complexes of the Russian threat to NATO. They insisted on increasing potential of collective security that was supposed to be deployed against Russia, first of all. And it was happening back in the 1990s and early 2000s when, because of the openness and goodwill, our goodwill, relations between Russia and the West were at high level. Russia fulfilled all its obligations, withdrew troops from Germany, from the Central and Eastern European countries, and it made a huge contribution in overcoming the legacy of the Cold War. We consistently suggested all kinds of cooperation, including in the format of the Russian NATO Council and OSCE. More than that, I will say one thing that I have never said before in public. I will say it for the first time. Back in 2000, when President Bill Clinton was visiting Moscow at the end of his term, I asked him, how would America see Russia joining NATO? I would not give you all the details of that conversation, but the reaction to my conversation looked, well, very reserved, let me put it that. I will say one thing that I have never said before in public. I will say it for the first time. Back in 2000, when President Bill Clinton was visiting Moscow at the end of his term, I asked him, how would America see Russia joining NATO? I would not give you all the details of that conversation, but the reaction to my conversation looked, well, very reserved, let me put it this way. And how did Americans really look at this possibility? You can see it in their practical steps in regard of our country. Open support of the terrorists in North Caucasus, ignoring our demands and our concerns in the security area, withdrawing from the treaties, arms treaties, and so on and so forth. It still begs the question, why? Why did they do that? What for? Okay, you don't want to see a friend in us, an ally in us, but why do you want to make an enemy out of us? The only answer that we got was, it's not about our political regime or anything else. It's just they don't need such a big and independent country as Russia. So that's the answer to all the question. That's the source. Answer to all the question. That's the source. Continues to get worse in strategic area as well. In Romania and in Poland, as part of the U.S. project, they deploy anti-missile defensive systems. We all know that the launchers deployed there can be used for cruise missiles Tomahawk. That is a strike weapon, strike system. And USA is also developing Standard 6 missile. It can not only be used as an anti-missile defensive tool, it can strike at targets on land and on the sea. So they are expanding their infrastructure and they get new offensive capabilities. From the information that we get, we have every reason to believe that further deploying the sites, the facilities of North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this decision has already been made. That's just a matter of time. We understand clearly that under this scenario, the level of military threat for Russia will be increased manifold. I would like to draw your attention once again that there will be a bigger threat of immediate attack against our country. In American strategic documents, their doctrine, there is such a possibility of preventive work against the missile complexes of the adversary. And who is the main adversary of the United States? We all know that, Russia. In NATO documents, our country is officially directly called a main threat to the North Atlantic security. And Ukraine will serve as the platform for such an offense. If our ancestors heard about that, they would probably thought that it's impossible. We don't want to believe that either, but that's how it is now. I want people from Russia and Ukraine to understand that. Many Ukrainian airfields are positioned close to our borders, and strategic NATO airplanes using high-precision weapons can strike targets in Volgograd, Samar, and Kazan and Astrakhan. Using reconnaissance tool will allow NATO to control the airspace of Russia up until the Urals. And finally, after the U.S. withdrew from the INF Treaty, the Pentagon has openly started developing a whole range of the land-based missiles with a range of 5,500 kilometers. If such systems are deployed in Ukraine, they can hit the targets in the European Russia and also behind the Urals. And the travel time of the Tomahawk missiles to Moscow will be less than 35 minutes. Ballistic missiles, 7-8 minutes. And the hypersonic offensive weapons, 4-5 minutes. That's like having a knife against our throat. And I have no doubt they plan to implement these ideas. And as it has been done previously when they expanded NATO to the east, moving infrastructure, military infrastructure closer to our borders, ignoring our protests and our warnings, they just didn't care about that. They did whatever they deemed necessary and appropriate. And I believe they plan to continue doing like that. Because they see us as a dog barking at the caravan. We have never agreed to that, and we never will. Russia was always standing for resolving the most difficult issues at the negotiating table. Diplomatically, we understand our responsibility for global stability. Back in 2008, Russia has come up with an initiative on signing an agreement about European security, and its idea was, its gist was, that no state, no international organization at European Atlantic could not enhance its security at the expense of security of others. But our suggestion was refuted from the get-go because we can't allow Russia to limit the activities of NATO. We were told that legally binding guarantees of security, only NATO members can have such guarantees. And last December, we have sent our partners the draft document about security guarantees and also the draft agreement on the measures of enhancing Russian security and NATO member security. In response, NATO members and the U.S. were saying a lot of words. There was some reasonable ideas, but they were talking only about secondary things. And it looked as an attempt to bring this and finally bringing back the military infrastructure back to the configuration of 1997 when the founding act was signed between Russia and NATO. These principled proposals were ignored. Our Western partners, once again, they were saying same old words that every state has freedom to choose ways to enhance its security, to provide its security, to join any military alliances. So nothing changed in their position. They talk about the same open doors policy. More than that, once again, they try to blackmail us. Once again, they threaten us with sanctions. And I think they will still impose those, introduce those as strong and as more powerful our country becomes. They will always find an excuse to introduce more sanctions, regardless of the situation in Ukraine, that is. The only goal they have is to contain the development of Russia. And they will do that like they did it before, without any formal excuse only because we exist, and we will never concede our sovereignty, our national interest, and our values. And I want to be frank, in the current situation when our proposals about equitable dialogue about principal matters had no response from the US and NATO, when the level of threat for our country is becoming greater and greater, Russia has every right to take countermeasures to enhance our own security. And that's how we plan to act. As for situation in Donbass, we can see that the Kiev elite keeps stating publicly about lack of willingness to implement the Minsk agreements to settle the conflict. They are not interested in peaceful resolution. Vice versa, they want to start blitzkrieg, like it happened back in 2014 and 2015. And you remember how it ended. Now almost every day they are shelling settlements in Donbass. They have amassed large troops. They are using offensive unmanned vehicles and other heavy machinery, torturing people, children, women, elderly people. It doesn't stop. It doesn't cease. We see no end to it. And the so-called civilized world, and our Western colleagues proclaim themselves as the only representatives of this free world. They prefer not to notice this, as if there is nothing like this happening. There is no genocide perpetuated against 14 million people. And the only reason is that these people didn't want to back the coup d'etat in 2014. They stood against the nationalist movement, the movement towards nationalism, Stone Age nationalism and Nazism, and they want to defend their basic rights to live on their land, to speak their native language, to preserve their traditions and their culture. How much longer that could go on? How much longer can they bear it? Russia did everything it could to keep the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We tried hard to implement the resolution of the Security Council of UN 2202 that endorsed the Minsk agreements on resolving the situation in Donbass. But everything was done in vain. The presidents are changing, the parliament members are changing, but the idea of the aggressive regime is still the same, regime that seized the power in Kyiv. It was created by the coup d'etat of 2014, and those who chose the way of violence, they admit they see no other way to resolve the Donbas crisis other than the military way. In this regard, I deem it necessary to make a decision that should have been made a long time ago, to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. And I would like to request the Federal Assembly to support, to back this decision and ratify the agreement of friendship and mutual help with both republics. We will draft this document and sign these documents in the near future. And those who seize the power and keep the power in Kyiv, we demand to stop hostilities immediately. Otherwise, all the responsibility for the possible continuation of the bloodbath will be on the consciousness of the regime that is ruling in Kyiv. By declaring these decisions, I'm confident that I will have support of the people of Russia, all the patriotic forces of Russia. Thank you for your attention.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.